Septembre 15, 1944, Peleliu Island. The sun was brutal, the air heavy with coral dust and heat. U.S. Marines crept forward through shattered palms, rifles tight in their grip. The coral ridges ahead were alive. Unseen Japanese guns spat bursts of fire through narrow slits carved into the rock. Every approach was a death trap. Every inch forward cost blood. Then, through the smoke, a new sound emerged, a low hiss, almost mechanical. A Marine carrying 2 heavy fuel tanks on his back moved into view, bent under their weight. A flame gun rested across his chest, its nozzle gleaming like a serpent's tongue. Behind him, another Marine uncoiled the hose. The air shimmered as a jet of liquid fire roared into the nearest bunker. In seconds, the entire opening bloomed into flame, a wave of orange and black rolling into the cave's dark throat. The gunfire stopped. A dull explosion followed, then silence. The men waited, the smell of burning oil mixing with sea salt and cordite. For the Japanese inside, the defense had ended in fire. And for the Americans, the weapon had just proven its terrible purpose. By late 1942, the Pacific War had become a brutal stalemate of attrition and geography. Every island, every ridge, and every coral atoll had become a fortress. What began as a sweeping advance of Japanese forces across Asia and the Pacific now hardened into a desperate defense. After the catastrophic defeats at Guadalcanal and the Solomons, Japan's Imperial General Staff adopted a new doctrine: to turn every island into an impregnable citadel. They called it defense in depth. The Americans called it hell. On paper, the Japanese defensive philosophy was elegant. In reality, it was monstrous. Engineers and infantrymen spent months digging into coral rock, building tunnels, bunkers, and interlocking pillboxes invisible from the air. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Tinian, and later at Peleliu and Iwo Jima, the pattern was the same: concrete reinforced by coral, firing ports just wide enough for a machine gun, and tunnels linking dozens of fighting positions. Soldiers slept, ate, and fought inside these networks, surviving weeks under bombardment. For the attackers, it was like fighting ghosts who lived beneath the earth. At Guadalcanal in 1942, American troops first realized how difficult it was to root out Japanese soldiers who refused to retreat or surrender. But the problem grew far worse as the U.S. island-hopping campaign reached the Central Pacific. The Japanese understood they could not match American naval power, so they decided to make the cost of every island unbearable. Their objective was simple: bleed the U.S. Marines and Army until America hesitated. If each island demanded thousands of American lives, Tokyo believed, perhaps Washington would negotiate instead of invade. That belief reshaped Japanese fortification strategy. On Tarawa in November 1943, 4,500 Japanese defenders fought nearly to the last man. American artillery and naval firepower leveled most of the island, but hundreds of Japanese remained hidden in bunkers that grenades and rifle fire could not reach. Marines learned that even after dozens of explosions, bunkers still spat bullets. It was there that the U.S. military understood brute force alone would not win this war. They needed a weapon to reach inside the earth. The idea of using fire in war was ancient, but in the 20th century it became a science. The first modern flamethrowers had been used by the Germans in World War I, crude, short-ranged, and dangerous to the operator. After 1918, most armies abandoned them, but the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service kept studying the concept quietly through the 1930s, developing portable designs that could project burning fuel over 20 yards. These prototypes were rarely used, until the Pacific revealed their grim necessity. In 1943, the U.S. introduced its first standardized model, the M1A1 flamethrower, weighing nearly 70 pounds when fully loaded. Its tanks carried a mixture of gasoline and napalm thickener, which burned hotter and longer than plain fuel. Operators were trained to approach within 30-40 yards of a target, pull the ignition trigger, and unleash a 3-second burst of flame. The weapon was devastating in confined spaces. The fire consumed oxygen, filled tunnels with smoke, and produced lethal heat that turned fortifications into furnaces. But the weapon came with a cost. Flamethrower operators were among the most exposed soldiers on the battlefield. The fuel tanks on their backs made them prime targets. Japanese marksmen quickly learned to aim for the tanks, hoping to ignite them with rifle or machine gun fire. Operators often worked in pairs, one carrying the weapon, the other covering him with a rifle. Most never survived their first assault. Yet, those who did became indispensable. By the time of the Mariana campaigns in mid-1944, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the flamethrower was no longer experimental. It was essential. Japanese bunkers there were deeper and stronger than ever before. At Saipan, a single position could withstand hours of naval bombardment, only to reopen minutes later, spitting machine gun fire at advancing Marines. To clear such defenses, the Americans developed specialized teams, two-man flamethrower units working alongside demolition squads armed with satchel charges. The rhythm of attack became mechanical, fire to drive the enemy deep, explosives to seal the position, then move on. Reports from the field were grim but conclusive. The combination worked. Where conventional attacks stalled, flamethrowers turned stalemate into progress. The flame didn't just destroy, it terrified. Few soldiers, no matter their courage, could withstand a weapon that swallowed air and light. The Japanese defenders, bound by their code of no surrender, often died where they stood, refusing to abandon their posts even as fire rolled toward them. By late 1944, these tactics had become doctrine. Every Marine division trained flamethrower teams before deploying. The U.S. Army even mounted flamethrowers on tanks, creating mobile infernos like the M4A3R3 Sherman Ronson, nicknamed for the cigarette lighter that always lights. The tank-mounted versions could project fire over 150 yards, allowing assaults on caves and cliffs without exposing infantry. The effect on the battlefield was profound. In operations across the Pacific, from New Guinea's jungles to the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, the flamethrower became a symbol of both technological superiority and moral burden. Marines spoke of it in hushed tones, a weapon that brought instant results, but also nightmares. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers adapted, creating bunkers with false exits and trap tunnels to lure flamethrower teams into ambushes. But even their ingenuity could not offset America's growing mastery of combined arms. By coordinating flame units with demolitions, machine guns, and armor, the U.S. systematically dismantled the once feared Japanese fortress defense. The next major test came on Peleliu, a small coral island in the Palau chain. Military planners expected it to fall in 4 days. Instead, it took over 2 months of savage fighting. The Japanese, commanded by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned beach defense and withdrawn into the island's interior ridges, a labyrinth of caves known as the Unbreakable Mountains. Inside, nearly 10,000 Japanese troops prepared to die. American artillery and airstrikes pulverized the surface, but beneath it lay an undamaged fortress. When the Marines advanced, they met invisible fire from all directions. Conventional tactics failed. Grenades and small arms could not reach the hidden defenders. The coral walls absorbed shock and heat. Every cave became a tomb that needed to be sealed by hand. Here, flamethrower teams found their true calling. One Marine recalled, "You couldn't see them. You couldn't hear them until they fired. The only way was to burn them out." By late September 1944, the U.S. military realized Peleliu was more than another island. It was a lesson in future warfare. The Japanese had mastered defense beneath the ground. To fight them, America would master fire. And in that crucible of coral and flame, a new kind of soldier emerged. The flamethrower operator. A man carrying both terror and salvation on his back. In the months that followed, the same doctrine would spread to every major battle in the Pacific. At Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the war's rhythm changed. No longer a contest of open battlefields. It became a fight through tunnels, cliffs, and caves. A war of inches and infernos. The Japanese soldiers who waited in those dark tunnels had never imagined that such a weapon could exist, one that would reach them where even artillery could not. For many, the first time they saw its light was the last thing they ever saw at all. And soon, the world would witness how that light turned the tides of some of the most brutal battles in modern history. The men who carried the flamethrowers were unlike anyone else in the ranks. They were not chosen for size or strength, but for courage and precision. The weapon demanded both. Each step toward a bunker was a gamble against death. A single bullet could ignite 70 pounds of fuel strapped to their backs. And yet these men volunteered. They knew that without them, the advance would stop. The Marine Corps had learned to pair flamethrower operators with demolition specialists, a lethal partnership that formed the backbone of bunker-clearing teams. A typical assault began with riflemen laying suppressive fire while engineers crawled forward through dust and coral shards. The flamethrower man followed close behind, hose coiled like a serpent. He waited for the signal, a hand raised, 2 fingers extended, then fired. The jet of fire lasted only seconds, but that brief burst could reach deep into concrete fortifications where grenades could not. When the flame stopped, the demolition man rushed in, tossing a satchel charge to finish the job. Then silence. One more bunker gone. These teams became the cutting edge of the Pacific campaign. They worked in pairs and small squads, advancing yard by yard through ridges that seemed alive with hidden fire. The sound of a flamethrower was unmistakable, a deep mechanical hiss followed by the roar of ignition, like a living thing breathing flame. The men around them gave these operators space. Even seasoned veterans felt uneasy near that weapon. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with burning oil, but behind that wall of flame, Marines advanced where no one else could. In the Japanese tunnels, the situation was different. For the defenders, the flamethrower was not just a weapon. It was a terror that stripped away every illusion of safety. Their doctrine demanded death before surrender. Inside their bunkers, they had food, ammunition, and the certainty that no mercy awaited if captured. But when fire came, there was no place to hide. It consumed oxygen, melted metal, and left nothing untouched. Many Japanese soldiers chose suicide, grenades against the chest rather than face being burned alive. Those who survived spoke later of the deafening roar, the sudden rush of heat, and the horror of light invading the darkness. The contrast between both sides could not have been greater. The Americans viewed the flamethrower as a brutal necessity, the only tool capable of defeating an enemy who refused to surrender. The Japanese saw it as the embodiment of hell itself. In one captured diary from Peleliu, a Japanese sergeant wrote, "We fight like ghosts under the earth. When the fire comes, the air disappears. We cannot breathe. The world turns to smoke and screaming." The tactical value of the flamethrower, however, was undeniable. American commanders quickly integrated flame teams into every assault plan. On Saipan and Guam, entire platoons were dedicated to the weapon. Tanks equipped with the POA CWS H-1 flamethrower system advanced alongside infantry, projecting fire hundreds of feet into enemy caves. The combination of mobility and range transformed how the Marines fought. Instead of costly frontal assaults, they could clear fortified zones systematically. Fire, explosives, then occupation. By early 1945 on Iwo Jima, this tactic reached its grim perfection. The island's volcanic rock had allowed Japanese engineers under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi to carve over 11 miles of interconnected tunnels. Artillery and bombing runs had almost no effect. The U.S. landing force quickly realized that every ridge, every crater was an ambush point. To survive, the Marines had to fight underground inch by inch. In this environment, flamethrowers became indispensable. Operators like CPL Herschel Woody Williams, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, used the weapon to single-handedly neutralize entire enemy strongholds. Williams advanced alone under heavy fire, crawling from crater to crater as Japanese machine gunners tried to target his fuel tanks. He moved in short bursts, aiming jets of flame into bunker openings. In less than 4 hours, he cleared 7 fortified positions. His weapon didn't just destroy the enemy. It broke their will to resist, but the human cost was heavy. Flamethrower operators had one of the highest casualty rates in the Marine Corps. They were prime targets, and the weapon itself was as dangerous to its user as to the enemy. If the tank was pierced, the fuel could ignite instantly, burning the operator alive. Many men described the job as a death sentence with a delay, yet they kept going. "If I stop," one operator wrote in a letter home, "the men behind me die." The psychological effect on those who wielded the weapon was complex. Some operators took grim satisfaction in its power, the immediate, decisive end it brought to battles that might have dragged on for days. Others were haunted by what they saw. Unlike artillery or airstrikes, the flamethrower made killing intimate. You saw your enemy's eyes. You heard them scream. You watched fire erase them. Many Marines avoided talking about those moments for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the weapon itself evolved. Engineers worked to extend range, reduce weight, and improve safety. The M22 flamethrower, Introduced in late 1944, became the standard. It could deliver up to 71-second bursts, projecting flames over 40 yards. Operators learned to fire short bursts to conserve fuel, sweeping the nozzle like a scythe. The thickened napalm mixture adhered to surfaces, clinging to walls, weapons, and flesh. Even in damp jungle conditions, it burned fiercely. On Okinawa, the final major battle of the Pacific, flame warfare reached its peak. The Shuri Line, a massive network of fortified ridges and caves, held nearly 100,000 Japanese troops. For weeks, American advances stalled under relentless resistance. Rain turned the battlefield into a swamp of mud and fire. The combination of flamethrowers, tanks, and demolition teams finally broke through. After weeks of fighting, entire defensive sectors simply ceased to exist, reduced to scorched rock and silence. Yet amid the tactical success, questions began to arise, unspoken at first, about the cost. The weapon's efficiency was undeniable, but so was its cruelty. Photographers and correspondents avoided capturing its full effect. The military censored most images showing what happened inside burned fortifications. To the public, flamethrowers were just another tool of victory. To the men who used them, they were something darker, a necessary evil that lingered long after the shooting stopped. For the Japanese soldiers, the experience was equally complex. Many entered battle prepared to die, believing their emperor demanded it, but few anticipated the horror of dying by fire. The Code of Bushido had no instruction for this. In post-war interviews, survivors admitted that the sight of flamethrowers demoralized even the most determined defenders. "We feared nothing," one recalled, "until we saw the fire." American command recognized this psychological advantage. Flamethrowers didn't just destroy fortifications, they shattered morale. Reports noted that Japanese resistance often collapsed in areas where flame units were deployed. The sight of burning tunnels spread panic through underground networks. Some soldiers fled deeper into the earth, sealing themselves in. Others charged suicidally toward the fire, choosing instant death over suffocation. By the end of 1945, the flamethrower had proven itself both tactically indispensable and morally unbearable. It cleared strongholds that artillery couldn't touch, but it also blurred the line between warfare and horror. Its presence on the battlefield marked a shift, a realization that modern war was no longer about heroism, but annihilation. For the men who carried those weapons, the memories never faded. After the war, many flamethrower operators destroyed their own uniforms and equipment, unwilling to keep reminders. Others joined veterans groups and spoke quietly of their missions, emphasizing not the killing, but the courage it took to walk forward with 70 pounds of fire on their backs. What began as an experiment in 1943 had, by 1945, become one of the most feared and effective weapons of the war. But the story was far from over. In the next stage of the Pacific Campaign, Iwo Jima, the flamethrower would not only change the course of battle, but define it. Because beneath that island's volcanic surface lay the most complex network of defenses the U.S. military had ever faced. And it was there in that black rock that the weapon would reveal both its power and its price. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. The invasion began under a sky blackened by naval gunfire. Battleships and cruisers had shelled the island for 3 days, turning its volcanic ridges into moving clouds of dust. From offshore, it seemed impossible that anything could still be alive. Yet when the first wave of Marines landed on the ash-black beaches, the silence was broken by a storm of machine gun fire. The Japanese had waited, hidden, until the beach was crowded with men and vehicles. Then from the cliffs and bunkers of Suribachi, they opened fire. Every inch of Iwo Jima was a fortress. Beneath the surface lay a labyrinth. Over 11 miles of tunnels, command posts, ammunition stores, and interlocking firing chambers. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island's commander, had designed it to absorb punishment and fight back invisibly. He had ordered his men not to die in futile banzai charges, but to inflict maximum losses from underground. His goal was not victory, it was delay and blood. The Marines quickly realized that the island could not be taken by bombardment or direct assault. The sand absorbed bullets and shells alike. The ridges, Suribachi to the south and Motoyama Plateau to the north, concealed guns that had survived weeks of bombing. Every cave was a potential ambush. Every ridge concealed hidden death. By the second day, the flamethrower teams were called forward. They were the only ones who could reach the enemy where artillery and rifles failed. The task was grim. Burn the defenders out of the tunnels, one position at a time. CPL. Herschel Woody Williams, a Marine with the 21st Regiment, 3rd Marine Division, was one of those men. His weapon, the M22 flamethrower, weighed almost as much as he did. His mission was to silence a cluster of pillboxes blocking the advance across Airfield No. 1. Covered by 4 riflemen, Williams crawled forward through volcanic ash, the air thick with dust and metal fragments. Enemy fire was constant, machine guns, rifles, grenades rolling down from hidden holes in the rocks. He moved alone, his tank hissing softly behind him. As he reached the first bunker, he aimed the nozzle and squeezed the trigger. A column of flame burst forward, roaring into the darkness. The gunfire stopped. When he released the trigger, smoke and silence poured from the opening. Williams moved on to the next. For 4 hours, he crawled from crater to crater, advancing alone. His riflemen fell one by one, but he continued, pausing only to refill his tanks. When it was over, 7 Japanese fortifications had been destroyed. The Marines broke through. For his actions that day, Williams received the Medal of Honor, one of the few flamethrower operators to survive long enough to accept it. All across Iwo Jima, scenes like this repeated themselves. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions used flamethrowers relentlessly, both portable and tank-mounted. The POA CWS H-1 Sherman tanks, modified with high-pressure flame projectors, became the most feared weapons on the island. Each tank could deliver fire up to 150 yards, burning for over 15 seconds per burst. Japanese defenders entrenched in caves and tunnels had no defense. A single tank could clear an entire ridge in minutes. The battle's geography turned every engagement into a personal confrontation. The island's sulfur pits and black rock magnified heat and trapped smoke. The smell of burning fuel, sulfur, and flesh hung over the battlefield. For the men fighting there, it felt as though the ground itself was on fire. Marines learned to coordinate their assaults with terrifying precision. Riflemen advanced first, identifying hidden firing ports. Then the flamethrower teams moved in low, often crawling. Behind them, demolition men carried satchel charges. Once the flame silenced a position, explosives sealed it. One Marine officer described it bluntly. We had to kill them one cave at a time. Fire first, then stone. For the Japanese, it was the apocalypse. Kuribayashi's men had trained for years to repel invasion, but nothing prepared them for fire that could reach underground. Some attempted counterattacks at night, emerging through hidden exits to strike from behind, but each failed. The Marines, hardened by months of island fighting, adapted quickly. Flamethrower teams now guarded the cave mouths even after clearing them, ready to ignite again if anyone tried to escape. By early March, much of the island's surface had been cleared, but resistance continued below. Japanese soldiers sealed themselves into deep tunnels, rationing food and water, waiting for the inevitable. American engineers used bulldozers to collapse tunnel entrances, but many remained intact. It was then that tank-mounted flamethrowers took over completely. They prowled the ridges, spraying flame into cave mouths until the entire area glowed red with heat. Reports from the 5th Marine Division described one such assault near Hill 382, later called the Meat Grinder. 27 flamethrower tanks worked in unison, sweeping the ridges with jets of fire while infantry followed behind. The operation lasted less than an hour. When the smoke cleared, the defenders were gone. The scale of destruction stunned even seasoned officers. Major General Keller Rocky, commanding the 5th Marine Division, wrote in his report, "The flamethrower is indispensable. Without it, Iwo Jima could not have been taken. Yet victory came at terrible cost. Over 6,800 Americans were killed and more than 19,000 wounded. Nearly all 21,000 Japanese defenders died. Most inside bunkers or caves, many by fire. When the island was finally declared secure on March 26, 1945, only a few hundred Japanese remained alive. The moral weight of that battle lingered long after. Soldiers who witnessed the effects of flamethrowers spoke little of them afterward. Some described hearing screams echo from sealed tunnels long after the fire stopped. Others remembered the eerie quiet that followed each assault, a silence deeper than any peace. Among the Japanese survivors, accounts painted the same picture. In post-war testimonies, they described the terror of waiting underground, hearing the hiss of fuel before the flame entered. One survivor wrote years later, The fire came like a living thing. It crawled into our holes, breathing. We felt the heat before we saw the light. For the U.S. military, the weapon had done exactly what it was designed to do: clear fortifications in minutes that otherwise would have cost hundreds of lives. But it had also changed the character of the war itself. Where once combat was fought at a distance, now it had become close, suffocating and absolute. There was no surrender in those caves, only annihilation. Even after Iwo Jima fell, the weapon continued its grim service. 2 months later on Okinawa, it was used again, on an even greater scale. Japanese troops entrenched on the Shuri Line faced waves of tanks equipped with flamethrowers. The results were catastrophic. Caves collapsed from heat alone. Whole defensive sectors vanished overnight. Survivors recalled that it felt like fighting inside the sun. By the summer of 1945, the U.S. military had perfected flame warfare. Engineers refined mixtures of napalm for longer burn time. Portable units grew lighter and more reliable. In total, over 10,000 flamethrowers had been produced and deployed across the Pacific. They had turned the tide in some of the most heavily fortified battles in modern history. But as the war drew to a close, the very success of the weapon raised troubling questions. Photographs of burned landscapes, melted fortifications, and carbonized remains circulated privately among officers. Few reached the public. The imagery was too disturbing, too intimate a look at what victory required. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the flamethrowers' role in achieving that end was undeniable, yet largely unspoken. It had been the weapon that made the island campaign possible, but it was also one that most men wished to forget. Years later, historians would call Iwo Jima the battle that defined the Pacific War. But for those who fought there, it was also the place where fire became the ultimate weapon and a mirror to the extremes of human endurance. The flamethrower's roar had ended the resistance. Its light had illuminated the darkest corners of war, and as the smoke cleared over the volcanic ridges, a new question emerged. What had it cost to win so completely? Because when the fires burned out, what remained was not triumph, but silence. The silence of an island that had witnessed both the limits of defense and the boundless reach of destruction. That silence would carry forward, into Okinawa, into the moral debates of the post-war years, and into the soldiers' dreams, long after the flames themselves had died. When the fires finally faded from Iwo Jima and Okinawa, what was left was not victory in the heroic sense, but devastation measured in ash, stone, and silence. The U.S. flag now flew over positions that had once been invisible fortresses, and the men who survived the inferno stood in landscapes unrecognizable to the world they had landed in. The ridges of Peleliu, the caves of Iwo Jima, the limestone slopes of Okinawa, all bore the blackened signatures of flame warfare. Where coral walls once gleamed white under Pacific sunlight, they were now charred and fused. Weapons lay melted in place. Helmets were scorched to bone. Engineers moving through cleared zones often found the tunnels still hot to the touch days later. For the Japanese defenders, the aftermath was annihilation. Fewer than 1% of those who garrisoned the major island strongholds survived. At Peleliu, nearly 10,000 men had been reduced to a handful of wounded prisoners. At Iwo Jima, 21,000 defenders became 216 survivors. At Okinawa, 94,000 soldiers and an untold number of civilians perished. Many by their own hand, many by fire. To the U.S. commanders, these numbers confirmed what they already knew. The Japanese Imperial Army would never surrender willingly. General Holland Smith, who commanded the V Amphibious Corps, wrote in his report after Iwo Jima, "We faced an enemy who preferred death to defeat. The flamethrower gave us the only way to break that will. On the surface, the weapon's impact could be quantified: reduced bunkers, captured ground, reduced casualties among advancing troops. But beneath that practicality lay something deeper, something that would haunt both sides long after the war ended. For the Americans, the flamethrower was a symbol of brutal efficiency. It had accomplished what bombs and artillery could not. But many who carried it or witnessed its effects struggled to reconcile its necessity with its horror. The Marine Corps' own psychological surveys after the war recorded unusually high rates of post-traumatic stress among flamethrower operators. Men who, unlike most soldiers, had seen the effects of their weapon up close. One veteran described it simply, You didn't kill from a distance. You killed inside their world. Some carried guilt for decades, even while knowing they had saved countless comrades by ending resistance faster. A few turned their wartime experience into advocacy, pushing for the weapon's removal from future arsenals. Others could not speak of it at all. For the Japanese who survived, the weapon left an indelible mark on memory. In the ruins of post-war Japan, accounts circulated quietly through families of soldiers who had perished in the Pacific, sons and fathers who had written home describing the new fire weapon that devoured everything. Letters found on the bodies of officers mentioned it with disbelief, calling it the enemy's fire dragon. In the years that followed, survivors who had fought in those tunnels spoke of it with a mix of terror and fatal acceptance. One Okinawan civilian recalled hiding in a cave with her children when the air suddenly grew too hot to breathe. "The fire did not touch us," she said, "but the heat took the air away. The baby died without sound." Such stories rarely appeared in official histories, but they endured in the quiet oral traditions of post-war Japan, reminders of a time when technology had turned elemental forces into instruments of war. The U.S. military, for its part, continued to refine flame weapons in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The M2 flamethrower was standardized across the Army and Marine Corps, and new vehicle-mounted systems were tested. But by the late 1940s, the weapon's reputation had begun to shift. The same images that had been censored during the war, blackened fortifications, burned-out caves, scorched bodies, now raised moral questions in a peacetime world still reeling from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The psychological toll of fire had become clear. The weapon's mere presence on the battlefield provoked panic and despair beyond its physical effect. At a time when international law was beginning to address weapons of unnecessary suffering, the flamethrower's future came into question. By the time the Korean War erupted in 1950, the weapon was still in use but under scrutiny. Tank-mounted flamethrowers cleared bunkers along the Pusan perimeter and during the Incheon landing, but public reaction was muted. By the Vietnam War, portable flamethrowers returned briefly, used against jungle fortifications and tunnels, yet even then they were increasingly viewed as relics of a darker era. By the early 1970s, the U.S. officially phased them out, replacing them with fuel-air explosives and napalm, airstrikes that achieved similar tactical results from a distance. The flame had outlived its carriers, but the lessons it left behind went deeper than the weapon itself. The Pacific campaigns had proven that technology could overcome even the fiercest human will, but at a cost to humanity's conscience. The flamethrower had stripped away all illusions of clean warfare. There was nothing abstract about it. No distant artillery, no strategic detachment. It was a weapon that demanded proximity, a man aiming at another man separated by only a few yards and ending him in fire. That proximity revealed the paradox of modern war. The same civilization that produced universities, symphonies, and cities of glass could also design a machine to project liquid fire into the earth. And yet the men who used it did so not out of cruelty but duty. They burned so others would not have to die charging into bunkers. They endured the burden of that fire so that the war could end sooner. Still, the image of flame, rolling through tunnels, consuming air and light, became one of the Pacific War's defining symbols. It was the visual representation of total war, destruction that left no middle ground, no survivors, no questions unanswered. The weapon achieved what it was built to do, and in doing so, forced the world to confront the nature of victory itself. In post-war Japan, decades after surrender, some veterans reflected on their final days in the caves of Peleliu and Iwo Jima with strange gratitude. "We learned," one said, "that even the emperor could not protect us from the fire." It was both confession and revelation, a recognition that loyalty and courage, while powerful, were no match for modern firepower. Historians later noted that the use of flamethrowers in the Pacific helped shape Japan's post-war aversion to militarism. The sheer scale of destruction, combined with the moral weight of defeat, reinforced the nation's turn toward pacifism. The fire that had destroyed the bunkers also burned away illusions of invincibility. For the United States, the weapon represented both innovation and introspection. It demonstrated the relentless ingenuity of a military determined to win, but also forced a reckoning with what victory meant in an age where human endurance could be extinguished in seconds. By 1946, War Department reports acknowledge that the flamethrower's greatest contribution was not just tactical, but psychological. It had taught the U.S. military how to confront a fanatical defense, and it had taught the world that even the most fortified will could be broken. But those same reports also recommended restraint in future conflicts, noting that the moral and emotional strain of flame operations is excessive upon all personnel. That duality, power and guilt, became the flamethrower's legacy. It embodied the brutal efficiency of total war, yet left an unease that no medal or victory parade could erase. As the decades passed, the bunkers of Peleliu and Iwo Jima became silent memorials. The coral healed, grass grew over blackened ridges. Tourists and veterans visiting the sites decades later found remnants of the old battles, rusted nozzles, empty fuel tanks, and the ghostly outlines of caves once sealed by fire. The air smelled only of sea salt and wind, but for those who remembered, the silence carried echoes of flame. In that quiet, the weapons story had come full circle, from invention to necessity, from fear to history. The flamethrower was gone, but its legacy endured in every debate about warfare ethics and the limits of human invention, because in the end, it had done what no other weapon could. It had brought men face to face, not just with their enemies, but with themselves, and when the last fires of World War II burned out, they left behind a truth far older than the war itself, that every weapon capable of saving lives can also destroy something far greater, the part of humanity that hesitates before it kills. The Pacific was quiet now. The smoke had cleared, but in the memory of those who fought there, the light of that fire never fully went out. The Pacific Ocean lies calm now. The waves touch the same shores where fire once reigned. Jungle and coral have reclaimed the scars, but beneath the soil of Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the heat of that memory still lingers, not in temperature, but in the history it left behind. The flamethrower was never just a weapon. It was a symbol of the extremes to which humanity could go when faced with an enemy that refused to yield. It represented the cold logic of war, a tool born not from hatred, but from necessity. To the soldiers who carried it, it was salvation and damnation in equal measure. They walked into tunnels carrying light that consumed everything it touched, knowing that victory and horror would arrive together. In its flame, the Pacific War revealed its truest face. No grand strategies, no elegant maneuvers. Only men, buried in ash and rock, fighting at arm's length for inches of ground. The fire stripped away all illusions of glory, leaving only survival and silence. When those same soldiers returned home, they rarely spoke of what they had done. Not because they were ashamed, but because words could not contain it. How could you explain the sound of flame-devouring air, the sudden quiet after it, the way light filled a darkness that no bomb could reach? They carried that silence like an unspoken prayer, a vow that such fire should never be unleashed again. Today, the flamethrower rests in museums, its metal darkened by time. Students and historians examine it as an artifact of innovation, unaware of the heat it once carried. But for those who know, it remains a reminder that war, when stripped of ideals, is a contest not of armies but of endurance. The Japanese soldiers who waited in their tunnels and the Americans who approached them with fire met at the end of civilization's logic, a point where reason and flame became indistinguishable, and perhaps that is the true legacy of the flamethrower, that even in victory its fire left no heroes, only witnesses. The bunkers are silent now, but the world still remembers the moment when man learned how swiftly fire could conquer stone, and how long it takes for humanity to cool.